So, my name is Ralph Schuman, and I have the honor of serving as president of this organization, and they have asked me to talk a little bit about some cybersecurity issues. We talk about TRID issues. We've been around the state talking about TRID. It's part of what IRELA does. We did in April a panel discussion for TRID with IDFPR representatives and folks who are involved in the title insurance industry. I think back there in the back row, Christine Sparks is one of the members of that group. That was a very interesting panel discussion. But today we're going to try to scare the bejesus out of you and talk about some cybersecurity issues. You know, this whole problem with business scams is growing. It's a growing problem for a lot of factors. U.S. News did a study that showed that executives are not really taking the steps that they should to protect and button down their financial operations. There are a lot of techniques that are being implemented. We are just naively going into that brave new world where we assume that because our snail mail was protected with an envelope and nobody would have the nerve to open it up, that our email is similarly protected, and our communications outside the office, communicating back with our headquarters, are similarly protected. Not so much. There's been billions of dollars lost, and this scam area is growing. One of the things that I said at the TRID panel is, there are growing pains with the implementation of TRID. Everybody's trying to figure out how to work with the closing disclosure and the other forms and the time deadlines. That will pass. I mean, we're going to get over the hump. Everybody will get used to it. We'll look back finally on those days when we thought TRID was going to be tough. But cybersecurity, I'm afraid, as long as the internet is with us and as long as digital devices are with us and telephones, it's not going to go away. We're going to have to deal with this. We're going to have to become flexible and proactive in our defenses. A lot of people impersonate company executives in emails that order staff to transfer accounts controlled by criminals. I'm going to mention a couple of times the FBI's IC3.gov website. That's a place where you can file a complaint if you've been the victim of some kind of business email scam or compromise or some kind of a wire instruction fraud or something like that. We will talk a little bit about wire instruction fraud scams, and I hope to have some valuable suggestions for you. It's going to amount to being kind of a potpourri, or as some would say in other counties, a potpourri of some of the issues relating to digital challenges that we're facing. The losses from these scams, which are known as business email compromise, totaled more than $2.3 billion as of February of 2015, and it's a lot more since then. There's been alerts that have been issued by the FBI. As a matter of fact, last October was declared Cybersecurity Awareness Month because they're trying to make people aware of some of these challenges so that they can protect themselves. There have been a lot of attacks that have been going on. The compromises that are going on are on the rise, and cybersecurity experts expect these losses to grow because they're just high profits. A former federal prosecutor who's involved in a task force studying these things was quoted as saying, "It's a low-risk, high-reward crime. It's going to continue to get worse before it gets any better, and we just have to learn how to deal with it and how to, well, take appropriate steps." None of the steps that I'm going to recommend today are going to fix everything. I'm not going to stand here and say, I'm the only guy who can fix it. I'm the only guy who knows the system. I'm going to fix everything. No, but some of these things implemented on a cumulative basis can button you down and make you a little less susceptible to some of these problems. And I want to make sure we talk about some of the professional responsibility issues. We'll talk about some of the Illinois Supreme Court rules in this area and what our responsibilities are currently. These fraudsters go to great lengths to spoof company email accounts. They do a lot of spoofing, they do a lot of phishing, they do a lot of social engineering. If you haven't heard these terms yet, you will be hearing them more and more as we go on here. They research over a period of time, usually because somebody's visited a public browser or some social media site. Keylog malware has been downloaded unbeknownst to them in various ways to a PC, and that gives them a chance to monitor what's going on and look at patterns and look at who handles the money and look at who has the responsibility for making a payment or initiating a wire. And then they time their attack in a very sophisticated way, because we're not dealing with kids. This is not Matthew Broderick's little kid character in War Games, who just does a dial-up modem and hacks into the Department of Defense. We're talking about sophisticated cyber criminals, mostly in China and Russia, who have all sorts of resources available to them, and they're really good at what they do. They use language specific to the company that they're targeting. They'll request a wire transfer using dollar amounts that lend legitimacy. They won't pick just a random round number. They'll use a number that has been used before in the context of the business that's being handled by that company. They often target businesses that either work with foreign suppliers or regularly are involved in wire transfers. Does this sound like something that might affect real estate lawyers? Austrian aircraft parts company lost 50 million euro, $55 million recently through a scam like that. And the FBI says there's been a 270% increase in identified victims and exposed losses since January of 2015. What is encryption? A lot of talk about it. There's a history of cryptography that you can look at. You know, it basically involves randomly scrambling zeros and ones and recombining them. There are public keys. There are private or secret symmetric keys. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts and, you know, the under the hood kind of stuff about how this works, but you need to know that there are options out there for encryption and that you should have a public domain for your website. Don't be sending email from, you know, johnqlawyer@hotmail.com, or for God's sake, don't be using AOL, because it's just a red flag to these hackers. They look at what's going on. They can get into it very easily. They find out what your patterns are. They can find out in many ways very easily what your passwords are if you're not careful. And then they launch an attack that can cost you a lot of money. One of the things that we talked about, the multi-board contract, as Joe knows, has a provision for allowing digital signatures. And we look back to 1999 when there was some legislative enactments in Illinois that foresaw the use of digital signatures. And the Secretary of State at one point was saying that they were going to develop individual asymmetric algorithms for each person as a sort of a personal digital ID, and that would be what would be used for signing documents with digital protection. Do you have your digital asymmetric ID? Call it budget problems. I don't know what happened, but for some reason we haven't seen those asymmetric personal IDs materialize. A lot of situations have come to the attention of the press. We've heard about them. You know, if some of these situations didn't give you pause, you can't live under a rock. You got to be aware of these things, and you have to take appropriate steps. In March 2013, Wells Fargo had their online and mobile banking accounts jammed. Logins were blocked for a long period of time. Target, of course, you heard about the hacker stealing credit card data of 40 million customers, personal information of another 70 million customers. Home Depot, this was a big one in the news. September 2014, a cyber attack exposed 56 million credit card numbers. The company was expected to pay $62 million to try to recover from this and correct the problems. JP Morgan Chase had a breach affecting 76 million households. You know, the FBI has this division, and you can file complaints, and you know it's in your materials, www.ic, Arabic numeral 3, all one word, .gov. It's an internet crime complaint center, and you can file a complaint there, and don't view this as just something you might think about doing. If you are hacked, or you're the victim of a business email compromise, or you're a victim of any other kind of business digital scam, by all means do the report, because they're compiling data, they're analyzing patterns, and they're going to take steps to help us keep our fortress a little bit more protected. Everybody's looking for that one firewall or that one virtual private network or that one password manager that's going to solve all the problems, or that one digital solution that's just going to make you impregnable. I take the approach that we should have a castle with multiple lines of defense. You've got the outer wall, you've got inner walls. No one step is going to be determinative or complete, but that's the image that I want people to have. TRID and FBI and best practices all play together here. The attorneys who are practicing today have a lot more challenges and a lot more responsibility in terms of protecting client information and avoiding these hacks and these scams. And of course, you're all charging still the $350 that was charged back in 1975 for your transaction, right? So you've got nothing but money to spend on solving these problems. This is an image of the ic3.gov website, and that red button there is where you can press on to file a complaint, and we recommend that you do that. Their analysis of crimes reported by global victims included non-payment or non-delivery, identity theft, auction, employment, advance fees, credit card fraud, personal data breach. They had over 250,000 of these global victims that they were reporting in their recent summary of this. You got the fraudulent wire transfers. These are payments that are sent to foreign banks that may be transferred several times but very quickly disappear. Asian banks are involved in this. Most victims report using wire transfers as the common method of transferring funds for business purposes. And as you know, there are often wire transfers involved in real estate transactions. Some victims report using checks. The fraudsters use the method most commonly associated with their victims' normal business practice. They're not stupid. They're not going to do something that's going to cause the eyebrows to go up. And when they do the social engineering and they ask the person as the new hire to initiate a wire transfer quickly because it's important and the CEO wants it, they are pushing buttons that we all have where we want to cooperate, we want to be helpful, we don't want to be left out, and people will initiate these things in a rush and then later on say, well, maybe that $1.1 million shouldn't have gone out quite so quickly. There are situations where there are business executive and attorney impersonation scams. They'll contact an employee pretending to be a business executive, say an attorney will be calling later. I don't like that members of our profession are being thrown under the bus in this way because no attorney actually calls. The call that comes later on is from someone who's pretending to be an attorney, and then they're requested to assist in the handling of confidential or time-sensitive matters that involve the transfer of funds. The employee is pressured to act quickly or secretly, and sometimes these requests occur at the end of the work week to coincide with the close of business of international financial institutions. There are a lot of factors at play here. No one solution, again, but there are some simple steps that can be taken. Try to avoid getting keylogging malware on your computer. Everybody know what that is? That's, that hidden thing that comes because you clicked on a link in an email that looked like it might be from somebody you knew, but it really wasn't, and you downloaded, say, malware that's going to be ransomware. Maybe you're a hospital and you clicked on this, and all of a sudden you can't access your public records, you can't access your patient records. We could get down into the bytes, the on and off bits on this, but essentially what happens is through some method, either visiting a social media website or clicking on a link improperly in an email that looked like it was from somebody you knew but really wasn't, some malware is downloaded, a macro is initiated on your computer, it's running in the background, it's going to be hidden in the type of file that you don't recognize, or maybe it's hidden because you haven't enabled file extensions to be seen on your PC on the names of files. And that malware basically over a period of months or even years will report to the bad people all the keystrokes. And then they group them, they analyze them, they can see at what time payments are being made. They can see, for example, when an association is about to send out dues notices for their annual dues for their members. What are the targets? A lot of times we see lawyers and law firms, real estate and title companies. Does this sound familiar? Investment firms and financial institutions are also at risk here. We do not, as small solo practitioner operations or medium-sized firms, have the big Fortune 500 IT department. We don't have highly paid professionals working night and day to protect us. And yet, obviously, because we're involved in real estate transactions, there are situations where large dollar amounts are being transferred. And so we're easy targets in that regard. It's something that we need to be aware of. The IC3 complaint, you click on that complaint button, it'll show you information. It'll talk about what's going on here. Please do not assume that because you file a complaint with the IC3 that they're going to contact the credit bureaus and correct the problems that have resulted to your credit rating because of the scam. No, they're going to do their job, and they're going to investigate it. They want all the relevant information. They want to know if there are phone numbers that are provided. They want to know what were the circumstances, what was the timing. Did the caller have a foreign accent? Did any of the emails have a funny spelling of a word? Was there a grammatic imperfection? Report to them whatever you can about this, because we need to help them analyze the patterns and develop defenses for us. Let's talk about the Internet of Things. I've got a little Alexa device sitting there, and it warns me every day that I should be very careful about the Internet of Things. These days, you can digitally control, because they're sort of plugged into the Internet, light dimmers, thermostats, alarm systems, the Ring doorbell camera, where you can talk to the person at the door. Even if you're miles away, you can use your cell phone and talk to that person. And I'm somewhat conflicted to see that the Apple Home app, which is coming with the new iOS 10 upgrade, is allowing a lot more interfacing with a lot more household equipment. So what could this potentially lead to? On December 4th, 2017, a little before 9 in the morning, An executive at Goldman Sachs was swiping through the day's market report in the backseat of a hired SUV heading south on the West Side Highway when his car suddenly swerved to the left, throwing him against the window and pinning a sedan and its driver against the concrete median. A taxi ran into the SUV's rear fender and spun into the next lane, forcing a school bus driver to slam on his brakes. Within minutes, nothing was moving from the Intrepid to the Whitney. When the Goldman exec came to, his driver swore that the crash hadn't been his fault. The car had done it. We have situations where people are envisioning in a sort of War of the Worlds type scenario what could happen. That story, which appeared in the New York Magazine, went on to talk about how for weeks a group of hackers had been sending LinkedIn messages to employees at Columbia Hospital. Now, the employees and doctors there at the hospital, as they were watching on the television the images from the George Washington Bridge chaos, they were trying to access their files and their patient information. They knew several crash victims would soon be heading their way. The third-year resident, when she got to her computer, tried logging into the network to check on the patients who were already there, but she was greeted with an error message that read, "We're not looking for Bitcoin this time." Now, this is a fanciful exercise that appeared in the magazine, but it's based upon hacks that really happened or could happen. For example, it's undisputed that in 2015, car makers began paying greater attention to the fact that some new vehicles, now connected to the internet, had become hackable as laptops. In March, researchers found hackers were able to access the ignition on Audi, BMW, Ford, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, Lexus, Mazda, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Range Rover, Subaru, Toyota, and Volkswagen cars. I think they could also adjust EPA results on the Volkswagen cars. In 2015, for an article in Wired, 2 hackers in St. Louis took control of a Jeep traveling 75 miles an hour, sprayed wiper fluid so badly that the driver couldn't see, and then cut the transmission. These are facts. These have happened. Homeland Security is concerned about this. They're worried about not if, but when a big cyber attack is going to come. They estimate that it's going to cost more than $50 billion and cause 2,500 fatalities. The National Intelligence Director, James R. Clapper, on February 9th of this year, listed in order the top 3 risks, potential threats, and higher than weapons of mass destruction and higher than terrorism was cyber and technology attack. Gives you pause. Hackers recently sent Pennsylvania drivers fake traffic tickets with malware using GPS data, so the tickets seemed to be from red light cameras on their route home. I'd like to think if I got a red light ticket, I'd know whether I went down that street, but if it looks authentic, you don't necessarily know. The average data breach is only identified 5 months after it begins. Hackers were allegedly inside a Ukrainian utility network for 6 months before shutting off electricity. The key hackers that the Department of Defense and the people who study this are looking at are those in Russia and China. And they have lots of reasons of believing that it was Russian hackers who were responsible for the hacking of the DNC computer equipment before the Democratic Convention. In April, Newark's police were locked out of their computer system for 3 days. In March, a DC area hospital system was hacked and forced to keep paper records. Paper's great, it's thin, it's portable. But they got so overwhelmed they turned away cancer patients with radiation appointments. So they weren't able to get their radiation therapy that they needed. If you've ever watched Mr. Robot or some of the shows on this, we're talking about the world being divided into white hats and black hats. The white hats are the good guys. The black hats are those that have decided that they're going to make a lot of money. And there's a lot of financial incentive for them to do this. What steps can we take? I'm going to have to shorten my talk here a little bit because I got a lot that I wanted to cover, but I know the people have appointments and they need to get where they're going. Cybersecurity Awareness Month last October, the FBI suggested, tip 1, protect yourself with 2-factor authentication. That's also called 2-step verification. We'll talk about that. Being vigilant with your Internet of Things. Don't tell your Alexa device about your plans to engage in some kind of illicit or improper activity. And don't even mention what kind of diapers you think your grandchild should have, because you may be greeted with ads for the organic disposable diapers in the margin on any Google search that you do. How does it happen? I don't know. I've asked Alexa. Alexa doesn't seem to understand the question. You should use defense in depth for everyday users, and there should be care and use of social media. I've talked about most of these points. The hospital in LA that got malware downloaded ended up paying $17,000 to get access again. And the Russian hackers that were involved have even set up English language call centers to explain to victims how to acquire and send bitcoins. As the New York article suggests, they don't think that they're going to be satisfied with Bitcoin. Next time they're going to want hard cash. Oh, I love this one. In 2014, an Ohio man remotely accessed the thermostat. You can do this. You can access these digital devices. Remotely accessed the thermostat in the home of his ex-wife. Who had left him for another man. Since this past Ohio winter has been so cold, I've been messing with the temp while the new lovebirds are sleeping, the man wrote in a review of the thermostat on Amazon. Doesn't everyone want to wake up at 7 p.m. to a 40-degree house? He gave the thermostat 5 stars. You know, that Amazon Echo, it's great if you want to have a joke. It plays playlists and music from Amazon Prime. You can ask it what the weather is. You can ask it for a Wikipedia article. You can ask all sorts of questions. I've asked it to tell me jokes. I've asked it to tell me the time. It wakes up with a single word. It's not waking up right now because it didn't want to play nicely with the Wi-Fi here. But I've asked it whether or not it listens all the time. And it's funny, when I ask it that question, it just says, sorry, I don't understand the question. The Internet of Things suggests that there are a lot of bad actors out there and they're using technology to try to access our information, and we need to be very careful about it. Here's an artist's rendering of that hospital that had the malware where they couldn't access the patient records. Beds are piling up in the hallway. People aren't getting their care. The FBI has a brochure on ransomware that's certainly worth looking at. It has a lot of recommendations about how to deal with it. I'll talk about a couple of things. That cyber division is the back of the thing. It talks about some basic principles to protect yourself, which we'll cover. The Illinois Supreme Court rules. This is an important thing for you to understand. If you haven't paid attention to some of these changes, you know, these are the result of the ABA model professional rules being implemented in various states. And Illinois adopted an amendment to Rule 1.1, which deals with maintaining competence. Comment 8 was adopted last fall, and that requires, of course, keeping abreast of changes in the law and its practice. But they've added language that says, including the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. What does that mean? Well, maybe it means that you should be careful about using your technology to initiate an email that results in a lot of money going to the wrong wire transfer account and then being spirited across the Atlantic or the Pacific in a nanosecond. 1.6e, confidentiality. A lawyer will make reasonable efforts to prevent the inadvertent or unauthorized disclosure of or unauthorized access to information relating to the representation of a client. And the comment 18 says the unauthorized access or unauthorized disclosure does not constitute a violation of paragraph E if the lawyer has made reasonable efforts to prevent the access or disclosure. Well, what are reasonable efforts? There are factors that the rule says should be taken into consideration, such as how sensitive is the information? What's the likelihood of disclosure if no safeguards are taken? What's the cost of employing additional safeguards? What are the client's instructions? Did they say take all steps necessary to protect my information? And what are state or federal law requirements? 4.4, inadvertent disclosure, respect for the rights of third persons. Of course, you shouldn't use means that are calculated to just embarrass or delay or burden a third person. And a lawyer who receives a document or electronically stored information, that's new language in there, relating to the representation of the lawyer's client and knows that the document or electronically stored information was inadvertently sent, shall promptly notify the sender. And the comment says, this electronically stored information or document is accidentally transmitted, such as when an email is misaddressed or a document or electronically stored information is accidentally included with information intentionally transmitted. This includes metadata. What's metadata? Mr. Sims and Mr. Pietro always talk about metadata. Suffice it to say, it's the topic that we could spend another hour on. But if you're going to send a document to somebody in your litigation with and you send a Word document, if you just send a Word file, there's a ton of metadata in there. You can look at prior drafts. You can see what's going on behind the scenes. Minimum step, convert it to a PDF before you send it to opposing counsel. I worry about the perfect storm situation. I worry about real estate practitioners being burdened by the compliance requirements of TRID, best practices requirements, and compliance with some of these Illinois Supreme Court rules. ALTA best practices require that you have written policies for handling non-public personal information, NPI, that you maintain computer and network security. We want to make sure that you're not compromising client confidential information. You certainly don't want to be involved in careless transmission of wire instructions. I'm working as an expert witness in a case where $1.1 million was lost, earnest money. The buyer received wire instructions from somebody using a commercially common browser. You know, I won't say the name, but it reminds me, it rhymes with sbcglobal.net. And the thought was that if you know that these browsers or these using of emails are going to cause problems or that they're suspect or they're subject to attack, for God's sake, don't do it. One of the things that you should be doing is setting up a business domain and using the business domain, which is going to be a little bit more under the radar for sending of any confidential information. You have to make sure that you adequately monitor your paralegals and other law staff. You have to pay a lot of attention to avoiding infection of your computer systems with malware, the keystroke software, or even ransomware. You have to have written policies on various things, and we can look at best practices. I think there's also an article I wrote for the ABA that's back there that talks about technology and protecting yourself. Remember the castle. I'm going to wrap it up here in about 5 minutes. Generally, you want to reduce your digital footprint to the extent that you can and make that smaller digital footprint less vulnerable to hackers. This may mean using separate systems. Maybe you purchase for a few $100 a separate PC that's used as dedicated for handling title work or handling financial work, and it's not one that you allow your other employees to use for surfing the web. To the extent that you can, you want to keep your critical data secure. We're talking about not just foreign threats. You know, if you woke up this morning and turned on the news, there's congressional hearings going on about what happened with Wells Fargo. They had a $100 million fine imposed by the CFPB. What were they doing? Well, they were opening lots of accounts for their customers without their knowledge or consent in order to obtain financial compensation for meeting sales targets. These employees are under an enormous amount of stress and pressure to produce, and they're all looking for ways to have additional revenue streams. Does this sound like what's going on with our real estate brokerages and how they're branching out into captive title insurance companies to have additional methods of generating revenue? The $100 million fine that the CFPB imposed was a result of an investigation that was started in California. People would have these accounts open without their knowledge. They were never authorized by the customers. Employees then transferred funds from the customers' authorized accounts to temporarily fund the new unauthorized accounts. And doing that, of course, triggered overcharges and overdraft fees. And then that would trigger a protective coverage from a credit card, which they didn't know existed, and that would trigger a cash advance fee. I mean, you could see there was snowball, and it was millions of dollars that were being extorted from these folks without their knowledge. They would issue and activate debit cards without authorization. They would go so far as to create permanent or personal identification numbers, PINs, PINs in this context is different from the real estate PIN, without the consumer's knowledge or consent, and that resulted in a lot of problems as well. They'd also create phony email addresses to enroll the consumers in these online banking systems. So a couple of recommendations. By the way, added to the $100 million was penalties imposed by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and another $50 million to the City and County of Los Angeles for a total of $185 million fine to Wells Fargo. Is that going to have a corrective effect? Are they going to be so chastised by this that they're going to change their practices? Well, let's see. They have always been talking about these clawback provisions that basically say you're not supposed to allow somebody to profit from these illegal activities and that you can't allow them to receive compensation that's tied to meeting these sales goals and having these illegal activities go on. Carrie Tolstead, who started with them right after the meltdown in 2008, was overseeing the division that handled this. Gee, let's see, she's walking away with about a $125 million retirement package. This isn't subject to clawback? Of course not, because it's not regular compensation. She's retiring. Oh, okay, so that's fine. If they can afford to pay her $125 million on the way out, do you think a $185 million fine is going to be an issue for them? I don't think so. Wire fraud. Briefly on this, There was a Washington Post article that talked about it. Of course, you don't want to send any sensitive financial information by email. If you're going to do something by email that involves this kind of sensitive information, have a telephone conversation where you confirm numbers. Some people talk about issuing a password or asking a client at the inception of a transaction to provide a word that can be used as a password, and then you exchange that in the telephone conversation to make sure you're dealing with the right person, and then you give information. Or better yet, step aside. You don't have to do this. You can just say to the buyer, you know, here's the number for the title insurance company. You call them, get the information for arranging the wire so your mortgage money can be wired to the title insurance company. The title insurance company would be happy to deal with them. And bear in mind, and John O'Brien has mentioned this in other situations too, your activities in handling these wire instructions or sending out an email, that's not the practice of law. That's more a clerical or banking function. So guess what? If you are covered by ISBA mutual policy, their counsel has provided an opinion to them that it's not being treated as a mistake which would be a covered incident under a professional malpractice policy. Folks, you are out there naked. You are on your own. This is not going to be something you can look to your malpractice carrier to help you with, so be careful out there. I know I feel like the guy on Hill Street Blues. Be careful out there. He always closed the briefing with people going out in the street with that. Clean out your email account on a regular basis. There can be patterns that can be developed and they can see these things. Change your usernames and passwords on a regular basis. Make sure to have your most up-to-date firewall and antivirus and anti-malware technologies going here. Be sure that if you are the victim of one of these hacks, that you contact the FBI at the IC3 website and file a complaint. One of the ways that make sure that you're protected on passwords is to have a password manager. 1Password is one that's used, and it's a very helpful thing. You only have to memorize one password then, and then you go into the app to get all your other passwords, and they can be complex. And you know, the more complex it is, the more difficult it is for these folks running these software programs to be able to figure it out. For God's sake, don't use the word password as your password. That's in the top 5 last year for one of the most common passwords. I think number 2 was 1, 2, 3, 4, followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because some of these things you have to have at least 8 characters, right? Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Nobody would ever figure that out. What's two-factor authentication? How many people have Gmail accounts? With Gmail, you have the option, if you haven't exercised it, to create two-factor authentication or verification. It's in the settings. You go in there and you select it. And then if I try to access my Gmail account to send an email or review an email, and I'm at a computer that's one I haven't used before, that IP address will be reported, and I will get a message saying, I'm sorry, you can't access this until you enter the 4-digit code that's just been texted to your cell phone. And if I've got my cell phone with me, I just put in that 4-digit code, and then I can get into it. But it's not foolproof, it's not conclusive, it's not determinative, but it's one more layer of protection. You should look into situations where that two-factor authentication or two-step verification can be used. There are dynamic tokens or pins that are used. Maybe a particular biometric can be used. You can use your location. There are ways that you can customize this to make sure that it's useful to you and it's helpful to you. It's also a service that's provided by lots of email service providers, Gmail, for example, social media platforms, cloud-based storage solutions, and even many banking and finance sites. Make sure that you look into whether or not it can be done. Make sure that if you don't use a password manager, that you're at least changing your passwords at least once a month. And make them complex. Don't use a standard word. Maybe you use initials that are the first initials of a word or a phrase, or maybe the first line of a song that you like, and throw in numbers, throw in asterisk, throw in other characters. Don't try to get Constant Contact to do two-factor authentication for you, because they won't do it. How many people use Constant Contact to send out newsletters? We asked them if we could have two-step verification or two-factor authentication implemented for our account, and they said, that's a great idea. However, we don't currently offer that option because there hasn't been enough demand for it. So you need to be proactive in this area and ask for help in this area and make sure that the people you're using are ones that do it. I haven't checked MailChimp yet. Maybe they allow it, and maybe a switch is appropriate. Cybersecurity Awareness Month also talked about defense in depth, and a couple of things that are important in there. Not a good idea to be doing your online banking in a Starbucks on a public Wi-Fi network. There are sniffers out there, people, and they can find out what traffic is passing through the network, and you can lose your privacy, you can lose your money. If you have to be in a situation where you're outside the office on a regular basis, accessing a headquarters computer, you want to look into getting a virtual private network, a VPN. That's a service provider. One of them, believe it or not, is called Hide My. In better circles, we would call it derriere, but it rhymes with ass. Hide My Ass. And so VPN that you can purchase on a monthly basis, and it allows you to have anonymity. Think of the difference between getting out of your house, getting in your car and driving to work, versus driving your car to a public garage where you get in and you switch to a different car and you drive out with a car that nobody recognizes. In a nutshell, that's what a VPN does for you. There are a lot of suggestions about what to do before an attack and after an attack. I'm just going to cut through these because we need to wrap it up. Do your war games analysis. When you have a plan in place, don't just assume that your protective plan is going to work. Test it. Run game scenarios. Get your people to participate in it, saying, okay, imagine we are subject to an attack. What would you do? How would you report it? Best practices require that you be up and running within X number of hours of the time that you are the victim of one of these attacks. Make sure that you don't just assume that your system is going to be successful, that you actually test it. After an attack, there are several steps that can be taken. Basically, assess it. Don't use it again, and don't use the system again until you're sure that it's been certified to be safe. Implement measures to minimize damages. Document. File the complaint. There are services that can be used here to help you with this. Do that post-incident review. Make appropriate changes. Fraud, cybercrime, or breach can target data, contracts, loan documents, loan applications. Those 1031s are really popular. They have a lot of information like social security numbers, and people can be fined enormous amounts by the CFPB for failure to monitor documents that contain this kind of NPI. So be careful about that. Use those complex changing passwords. Consider that password manager, two-factor authentication, defense in depth. One of the things that's important to understand is that if you just use an external hard drive attached to your computer as your safety, that can be compromised by ransomware. Ransomware is sophisticated enough to not only take over control of the primary computer, but also any device or accessory attached to it. So essentially, out-of-band backup says at a minimum what you should be doing is having multiple external hard drives, and one that is not attached at all times to your computer, and you rotate. Maybe you take it home once a week. You run your backup once a week. Because the one that you leave attached to the computer, if you're looking to get your information off of that one, probably going to be compromised by the ransomware. Change the default administrator name and password on your wireless router. Also change the default SSID. On your computer, disable the hidden file extensions. You want to know if the file you're looking at is a .jpg or a .wpd, whatever it is. You want to know that this file that's masquerading as a particular kind of file really has the extension that corresponds to that. And if you don't disable the hidden file extensions, you won't necessarily know. For God's sake, don't click on a link in an email if you're not sure of the source of the sender. You know, I've gotten lots of emails from attorneys, who've been hacked, and they'll say, oh, here's our information for our new location. Just click here and you can get access to it. Not a good idea. Also not a good idea to leave your computer on 24/7. Maybe you want to consider turning it off when you're not using it. An exception to that would be if you have an external IT provider. And I know, just because my time constraints, I don't have time to run the updates and make sure that all the security patches are installed and that the computer's humming along with all the Malwarebytes software applications correctly operating. So I have a service, like $40 a month. Every day, remote access is done. They update and check all the security. They do a backup, make sure that everything is as close to being protected as can be. We've got all these things coming together: the TRID compliance, the best practices compliance, the new Illinois Supreme Court rules, that comment on being familiar with relevant technology. That's not by accident. That's there. It may not be something that's going to really come up on your radar until a malpractice carrier refuses to cover a situation like that, saying that that's something you just need to be aware of as part of your operation of your office. It's not necessarily a professional malpractice situation covered by your policy. Make sure that you're protected. There's a concern about the so-called Luddite lawyer, you know, who's so entrenched in the 18th century that they don't want to give up their 1967 Commodore computer, or, you know, with a whole 64K of memory on it, because they don't think that this new stuff is worth looking at. Unfortunately, the nature of the practice is such that you need to be conversant with these issues, make sure that you're getting the help that you need, and protect yourself. That article that I wrote deals on some of these things, using technology to protect yourself and be in compliance. There were a few copies back there. It's also available on the website, IRELA.org. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It ties in best practices and some of these technological issues. I have this at the end of every PowerPoint because I think it's a real good idea to see your lawyer first. Tell your clients to see you first before they embark on a real estate transaction. And thank you.